Hey there. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Brianna Bowling. I am the founder of Retreat and Learn. And today very excited that we have John DeDakis, who is a journalist, a novelist, and a writing coach. He was a senior copy editor at CNN. He is a multi-book, he has published multi-books. I'm sorry, that doesn't come out right. He's published many books, and his books have won many awards, including Reviewer's Choice, Foreword INDIES, and the Feathered Quill. He was a former White House correspondent, and he teaches novel writing at literary centers, writers' conferences, and bookstores around the country and abroad. I was very fortunate enough to meet John at a writing workshop, unfortunately not abroad, at a local one. So I'm really excited to bring his knowledge to you. If you are with us live now, please say hi, write a little hello in the comments. It's terrifying to be on here live and not know who's with you, so we like to know who's here with us. And as we talk today, please post your questions in the comments so we can answer them live. And if you want to find future talks or past topics, you can follow us on Facebook or subscribe to our YouTube channel, both of them at Retreat and Learn. So I am really excited to bring in John. So I'm going to do that right now. So welcome, John.
Hi, Brian. How are you?
Oh, I'm so happy to bring this to everybody who's watching today, just because I've always enjoyed talking to you, and everything that you've taught me. That writing workshop that I went to, so many things happened from that. I was able to finish a book based off of a lot of the things that you taught me. And then in terms of grief, it's one of the reasons I actually started Retreat and Learn, was because I wanted to have a grief workshop and have the ability to help people who are dealing with grief and find better ways of doing so. And so part of that is writing. It's how I dealt with the grief of losing my mother. So I'd like to learn a little bit more from you about why you have, or how you've experienced grief and how you've used it to help you deal with your grief.
Well, I think that everybody experiences grief one way or the other. I mean, I think I experienced grief this morning when the alarm went off, and I went through all the stages of grief. There was denial. There was bargaining, 5 more minutes. There was anger, and all the way through to acceptance. And then you get up and you move on with your day. Seriously, though, I've lived a long time. And so there have been plenty of losses along the way. Aunts, uncles, parents. Probably a more traumatic one was my sister's suicide in 1980. And then more recently, the death of my youngest son, Stephen, who was 22 years old, and he died in 2011. So, there have been an accumulation of deaths and losses. But really, when you think about it, that's my sister Georgia there. And she was she was beautiful. She was smart. She could have been a concert pianist or a surgeon. And it was before we even knew what manic depressive was. And so I think that, part of it with her was not really knowing what it was that she had, and there were no medicines to really treat that. So there have been losses along the way.
I'm just going to leave a picture of your son too, because I don't want to leave him out here, because he's, I'm sure, a very important reason why you feel that grief is, how writing has helped you work through that grief. I think you shared, I believe that you wrote one of your books shortly after his death. Is that correct?
I did. My fourth novel, Bullet in the Chamber, this one here, was written while I was going through grief counseling, and you can see the image of the bullet in the syringe. I knew heroin was going to be a factor in this. He was missing for a week, and before he went missing, I discovered that he was using heroin and was at the point where he was ready to try to get some counseling, but he had to schedule he tried to make an appointment, and they were full, and so they said check back in 2 weeks, and 2 weeks later he was dead. Went missing, was missing for a week, and so I knew that heroin was going to be a factor in it. And so while he was missing, I came up with that image of the bullet in the syringe to underline the Russian roulette powerfulness of heroin.
I mean, I think what you experience, unfortunately, is something that so many people have experienced. Whether their child ends up, passing away, or whether they go missing, and especially right now with everybody's mental health. I mean, is definitely precarious. So, I mean, that's very brave of you to share, and I appreciate you sharing that and how it may have helped you. Now, in your case, you wrote a fictional book. But I would like to talk a little bit about, I mean, do you have to write fiction? What are the best ways of writing to overcome grief? I mean, is a book the best way? Did you also use other methods to deal with that grief in terms of writing?
Well, I journal like a fiend, and so that's probably for me the first touchstone for being able to work through things because my journal it's in longhand. I do it every morning, and the way I approach journaling is basically just to look at the day before, just the facts, ma'am. Um, but usually what happened the day before is enough to prompt sometimes a more in-depth dive on, why did I feel that way? Why did I say that? Why do I feel this way? And so journaling was the first way of dealing with that. Of course, when Stephen went missing and during the days and weeks after he died, I don't think I journaled at all. I mean, it was a blur. Grief, especially as profound as that, it's exhausting. And so I don't really have a very accurate emotional or even factual account of what was going on at the time. But there are any number of ways of dealing with grief, especially if you're a communicator, a writer. There's memoir. I mean, memoir is it's a true story, but it may not be. It's autobiographical, but it may not be an autobiography. I mean, an autobiography is this is everything that happened in my life, whereas memoir is more thematic, and so that's one way of capturing it. In my case, I'd already written 3 mystery suspense novels, so I had a protagonist, Lark Chadwick. I write as a woman, which is that's a whole
We're
nother
going to talk about that. Just
program.
to be clear, that's going to be a
um,
question.
but I already had a character and an ongoing story that I could tap into. And so what I did is I took Stephen's story and the time that he was missing and the heroin use, and I used that as a subtext or a subplot for the bigger story that Lark was dealing with. So in a very real sense, it was someone that Lark was close to who was addicted and went missing. So I was able to, as almost a catharsis, writing it, Stephen's story and my reaction to it was cathartic to be able to put it into the mystery suspense novel that I ended up writing.
So you took the parts, your experience, and I'm sure it was able to really kind of flesh out that book and very vivid details because of your experience. But do you think taking a step back from that and actually writing it from the perspective of someone else, did that help you write about something that was so painful that maybe if you had journaled, it wouldn't have worked as well?
Oh boy, I'm not sure because Lark is so closely attached to who I am as a person. And in fact, a lot of her psyche is really me with a skirt on. And so, to be honest with you, I mean, I cried during a lot of the writing of the story, and I've even cried since when I will look back at some of the scenes. And I mean, I don't apologize for that. I mean,
Sure, no, absolutely not.
it's healthy. I think it's healthy to cry, and so it wasn't a matter of detaching from who I am because I think who I am as a writer flows onto the page anyway.
Hmm.
So it wasn't a way of distancing myself from it because it was just as raw even when it was fiction.
Yeah, I guess why I asked what is that you said you didn't journal much, in the days afterwards, but you did continue to write your fictional novel. And so I didn't know if that maybe helped you, is it and I think everybody's journey is very, very different, obviously.
Yeah.
But I was just curious if that kind of that step back and kind of that filter, did that help somewhat in terms of being able for you to write, even though it was difficult to do so?
Well, it was difficult to write, but I was able to do it. And I don't really know if I've got a definitive answer for you other than I can say that it was possible to do, but it
Mhm.
took a long time to do it. I mean, I think it probably took maybe 2 years to write the novel.
Okay.
So, I mean, part of my creative process anyway builds procrastination into it. So I took my time with it and didn't rush it.
Okay. So, I mean, if other people, and there's people who are watching this, and the reason that they're watching is probably because they have dealt with some grief of their own, and they're trying to think about, hey, how can I use this as a tool to help me work through this grief? I mean, is there a particular time that you would recommend that somebody actually started doing this, or is there a better time or a better format or method to do so? I mean, and somebody who's maybe just experienced grief or somebody who's experienced it 10 years ago, do you have any suggestions for them?
Well, I can. One suggestion I'll make. I'll build on what you just said, and that is that grief is different for everyone. It's personal, and so what I suggest may or may not resonate with you. Um, I would suggest journaling. I would suggest having someone with whom you can talk. I would suggest a professional. I went through grief counseling through the Went Center for Loss and Healing in Washington, D.C. And of course, now with the COVID virus and a lot of lockdowns, many counselors are now doing their work online. So even if you live in Seattle, you may be able to get a slot at the Went Center. It's WENDT, this Went Center for Loss and Healing. And so, and I really recommend talking with a professional, someone who's emotionally detached from you. They don't have a stake in how you deal with your grief. There's not an emotional investment in them with you or you with them. Therefore, you really can be brutally honest about your situation, about how you feel, because that kind of a relationship is non-judgmental, as opposed to maybe your mom or your dad or your wife or your someone who's close to you. They have their own opinions on how you should be living your life, and that can make life really difficult if their opinions don't line up with the way you like to live your life. So
Right.
having a professional weighing in, I think, at least for me, was critical. And I think I'll just make one more comment and then I'll shut
Sure.
up.
Yeah.
I think it's especially important for men because um, um, we're almost taught not to cry and to tough it out and to be strong. And I think there's probably some wisdom in that. I mean, you don't want to just fall apart all the time. You want to be able to be a functioning member of society. But profound grief has a profound emotional impact. And if you're the kind of person who tends to keep it inside and, just tough it out, it doesn't make the grief go away. It just keeps it bottled up inside, which can be corrosive. And it is going to find a way out. And often that may be counterproductive. Often we tend to try to anesthetize our grief. We use sex or drugs or alcohol or work or anything to cause us to escape from the pain. And I remember when I think it was one of my parents died, and maybe it was when my sister died. They all kind of blur together after a while.
Right.
But someone suggested move toward the pain. And that's almost counterintuitive, but I think it really is the first step toward healing.
So what does that mean, move towards the pain? I mean, I'm not sure what that means to me, and I bet you it means something different to you. What did it mean to
Ooh,
you?
good question. See, this is why I like talking to you, because you listen to the statements and then hold me to account. So,
Sorry.
have you ever considered journalism?
No, I haven't.
Well, you're actually doing it, ma'am. So there. Um, what does move toward the pain mean? And quite frankly, when I heard that the first time, I wasn't sure I understood it either.
Okay.
But I've come to realize or understand it for myself that it means don't be afraid of experiencing the pain.
Hmm.
Because one of the dynamics of grief that I've observed is there's a lot of fear involved in grief. And I probably the most intense fear is around the realization that you're never going to be with that person again, and
Hmm.
that never could be for decades. It could be forever. I mean, we're really not talking about afterlives or the spiritual, but for the foreseeable future, that person's gone. You have memories. Maybe you have, video clips or pictures or audio recordings to remember them, but there's never going to be that kind of interaction, and that is fearful. And so a lot of the pain is I think fear oriented, the fear of going ahead and living life without that person, and that can be pretty daunting. But it doesn't get rid of the actual fact that the person isn't there anymore, and you do have to go on. And the question then is, are you going to? Because we do have choices in life, and we can opt out. I don't think that's a particularly wise choice, but it's certainly a temptation that a lot of people have.
Right. No, I think you have so many good points there in terms of, moving towards that pain. And it's not just, I think it's not necessarily that people are, well, they're mourning the loss of that person and what they're not going to have. But also, I think more than anything, people are mourning the future with that
Yeah,
person, the loss of
right.
that future. And it's not, one of the things that I've discovered is that it's not always people who have died. I mean, we talk about grief. There's also the grief of what could have been, divorce, and all the
Yes.
grief that comes from that, the marriage that they expected it to be,
Yep.
somebody who's ill, somebody who has
Right.
somebody they're caring for that they thought that they were going to be able to, cruise the Caribbean next year, and now they
Right.
can't. Those things aren't going to
That's
happen.
right.
All of those are grief, and how do you deal with that? And so, I think you have such great points about that. So I thank you for
Yeah.
that.
Sure.
Um, so somebody who's thinking about, trying to sit down and saying, okay, I'm going to write to help me deal with these different things. Um, again, there's probably 8 million answers to this, but on your opinion and the things that you've experienced, is it better to create an outline? Is it better to just go with stream of consciousness? What's the best route to actually just start?
Well, a fair question. And it could be that you may not know what it is that you do want to write. In my experience, some people just have this inner urge to communicate or express themselves, and maybe not even to connect with another person, but just to get it out, almost a purge kind of thing. So one suggestion is, if you're still not sure what's the point, get a notebook, one of those spiral notebook, and just start writing. Just almost stream of consciousness. In fact, um, I think that if you write almost too self consciously, it can bring about a writer's block, because it's like you feel like, oh, this isn't perfect, and who's this for, and what are they going to think? Don't write for anybody but yourself, and make your first goal just to start writing and to get it down on paper. I've talked to some people who took actually did start keeping a journal when they were going through the initial stages of grief, and then have looked back on it several years later. And one person told me that they were surprised at how angry they were at the time. They'd forgotten that. They'd gotten it out, and then they moved on with their life. And it's almost as if, whoa, got through that, and then they almost forgot that they'd been that angry. So it can be a reminder of the grief process. I mean, it's a life observed. And so when you're taking a look objectively at your life, I think that's another avenue toward bettering yourself or better understanding yourself, because I think that's a key to being a good writer. The better you understand yourself, the more likely it is your writing will be authentic as
Mhm.
opposed to superficial.
Yeah, those are great points. So, it's crazy too. I'm just looking at the time, and it's unbelievable. We only have 10 minutes left, probably, of this, which is, it's amazing how quick these go. So
You
I'm
got you got a sponsor waiting to.
well, we don't have to actually finish, but I always say that we're going to be about a half hour. But yeah, we may
Okay,
go over. Who knows? It's so much fun talking to you. Who knows how long we'll go?
thank you.
Um, but before, I'm going to take a quick pause here. That if there's the people who are watching, if you have any questions at all for John, I mean, he is a really, really good resource for us all. So if you have any questions, feel free to post them in the comments, and I'll ask John while we are live. So just wanted to pause to say that. But the other part of it is that one of the things that I've noticed when I tell people, hey, you can journal, you can write, you can do all these different things, and they kind of look at me and they go, I can't do that. I don't know how to write, and they always want to correct what they're doing. And you kind of started to hit on that. and I could say, okay, so just don't do that. Just keep writing. But how do you get that voice out of your head that says, oh, that's not right. That comma's not shouldn't be there. How do you get that editor out of your head?
Well, that presumes that I do. Because I mean, for 25 years at CNN, I was an editor. I mean, my job was to look critically at the copy that the anchors would read. And so I'm a reflexive editor. I mean, that's just part of my DNA. But one of the things that I learned when I was starting to write fiction was to write the first draft when you do finally do the spade work and the prep work and figure out what your story is and who your characters are and where you're going to go with it. Write the first draft straight through and turn off your internal editor. You know, your mom sitting on your shoulder saying, you can't say that. Well, the first draft is the discovery draft. That's just getting it out there. And so there's also a psychological dimension to writing it straight through, and that is when you've worked through all the problems, the creative problems of your novel, and you've finished. The hardest part is to get through that daily dose of blank screen and then filling it up to the point where you finish the story. So finishing the story is an incredible accomplishment. The story sucks, but it's done.
It doesn't always suck. Come on.
Well, there are places that definitely do, and there are some other places of brilliance too. But then you go back and you look more critically at it. Now, the one thing I do that's sort of a compromise is I still build my stories one chapter at a time, but before I move on and have that forward momentum, I'll sit with a chapter for a day or two, and I'll do some proofreading and copy editing and fixing typos and stuff like that, roughing it in to the point where I've scratched the editor itch. Then I'll lock it in and move on to the next chapter. And I won't really go back to those chapters until I'm ready for the rewrite, which could be 6 months later. So you're actually seeing things that you haven't seen in a long time. And that gives you a sense of being able to see those chapters more objectively because they're fresh.
Right. Yeah, you're looking at them for the first time. So you're kind of almost like dividing it up into segments and then kind of letting yourself go back, edit that, and then move on. But write that segment just straight through. Don't correct yourself. And that gets that guy out of your head, whoever that mean editor is that we all have sitting on our shoulder. Right. So do you do an outline or anything before you start your books, or do you just kind of just go through? Do you know when you start writing a book, do you actually know where you're going to go?
I do. I'm a planner, but with a small p, because I like to have an idea of where I'm going, but I also want to leave room for the serendipity. And so if I at least have a vague idea of where I'm going, then that makes it easier for me to at least go. But when I was writing, I think it was Bullet in the Chamber, I think about halfway through the first draft, I hit the wall. I mean, I knew where point Z was, and I was at point D, but I didn't know how to get to P. And so for the longest time, I procrastinated. And then after a while, you can only do that so long, and it's no longer effective. And so I just started to write a chapter. And I wouldn't know where it was going to go, that particular chapter, until I actually wrote, because to a certain extent, that seat of the pants approach is like taking a straw and dipping it into your subconscious. And the act of writing stirs up the subconscious, and it comes through your fingers and onto the page. So there's an element of planning, but the serendipity and the just winging it can also be a gateway into something that's deeper, that's bubbling up inside in your subconscious. So I'm sort of a plantser. I plan, but I wing it too, seat of the pants.
Yeah, it sounds like almost like you have like different elements. You have the big headers, and then you fill in all the flesh between the headers, kind of thing. And I assume that every writer is going to do that differently, but it's interesting to know what your path is and how you do things. So, going back to when you're writing, and this probably applies to all writing, whether it's writing for grief or whether it's writing just, for commercial purposes, at some point you finish it, or you get to the point where you've done your edits and your things, and it's time to either show it to somebody or not. And obviously when you're writing for grief, it is for yourself. So you may never have to show it to anybody. You wrote it, you're the audience, right? But in the case where somebody does want someone else to read it and see it, how do you get up the courage, or what suggestions do you have for somebody to get up the courage to show it to somebody and selecting the right person to see it?
Ooh, that's a very good and practical question because in my case, it took, I think, after the first draft of Fast Track, which was my first novel that I finished. I think I finished the first draft in like 1995, and it
Okay.
took me a year and a half to get the courage to show it to anybody
And
because
who did you?
I
Who'd you show it
knew it
to?
wasn't it was awful, and I knew that, but I didn't know how to fix it. But that's when you need people in your life who will give you that objective feedback. And so um, you find people best the best people are the people with whom you don't share a bed or a last name, people who won't break your spirit, um, but who will love you enough to tell you what's not working, but they'll also tell you what is working, and you need that as well. So if you can find three people that satisfy that, you'll get the kind of objective feedback that will inform you on how to fix that draft and for the next one. And of course, my first novel went through 14 major revisions because there were several beta readers along the way. And I think that the agent that I have is the 39th agent I queried, and it took 10 years to find her. So it there were a lot of revisions. My story went from a 150,000 word mishmash to a 75,000 word mystery suspense novel
Right.
because of the feedback I got.
So who were the first people that you showed it to?
Well, I probably the biggest mistake I made. I don't know if Cindy, my wife, is listening or
No,
watching, but
I don't want to get you in
she,
trouble. Come on.
I won't. She knows the story. Probably the first mistake I made was to share it with her because I mean it was this gargantuan mess, and out of all the words, she underlined one and said, "Are you sure you want to use this word?" Well, out of 150,000 words, changing one ain't going to make a big difference when it comes time to getting an agent. She told me years later, she said, I didn't know if you were any good. I didn't want to break your spirit. So she could have done some really serious damage. And instead, she pulled all her punches. But I have to say that for my most recent novel, Fake, she was one of my beta readers near the end of the process and helped to bring it in for a safe landing.
Okay. Now that's more if somebody's trying to get a book published. If somebody's writing for purely for the point of trying to get over grief, um,
Mm.
and as somebody who's done that, I mean, you've used your writing to help you get over your grief, and you've experienced some very substantial grief. Is that something that you think that someone should hold in internally and keep that close to their sleeve, or do you think it's helpful to show it to somebody? Maybe you were talking about getting therapy. Is it helpful to show some of that writing to your therapist? Does it help reveal some things? And this is purely based off of your experience. Obviously, you're not a therapist or anything, but in your experience and how it's helped you.
Well, it's definitely personal, and it's up to the individual. I did share I did share I think some of the chapters with my grief counselor, who actually became a beta reader for the next book. But by that time, I wasn't in grief counseling anymore. But there were grief counseling sessions in Fake that built from Bullet in the Chamber because the series goes on. So she was able to weigh in on some of those. Um, I think that's a judgment call you have to make about whether you share it with anybody else. It's not a requirement. I don't think it's a requirement. I think it's more help. It's if you're going to do it that way, writing from your grief experience. I think that the act itself might be enough. It's not a requirement, in my opinion, that you have to share it with anyone. But if you are going to share it with anyone, then that a grief counselor would certainly be, a good first place to start. And one of the things
Right.
I didn't mention also that might be helpful for people going through grief are grief groups. I know that I've never gone into a grief group, but I've heard that especially for parents who've lost children, there are some groups that specialize in that and they bring people together. Because one of the things about grief is that you feel you're the only one going through it.
Right.
It's so isolating. And so there's a certain comfort in having other people around who've gone through, something similar so that you're not alone.
Right. Yeah, actually, one of the things that I did after my mom died is I started writing a blog on, and I called, I forgot the name of it now, but it was something along the lines of, what to do when your parent is dying. And it was just, I felt like I was helping the world by writing. Now, somehow helping other people's made me feel better, by sharing
Well,
things that
that's my question to you. What effect did it have on you by
on.
writing that?
Very
On
much. I like to help people. So when by writing that, that was very helpful to me. So sharing in my case was very beneficial, and putting it out there. So I was just curious how your experience was in terms of, you know, and in many ways, your novel was exactly that. You were putting out a lot of raw pain out there, and your experience of how it affected you. And, I'm sure reading that could help other people who are going through
well,
some of the
thank.
same things.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't want to give the impression that it's just this dark book, because it's a thriller, and
Sure.
so I mean, I'm still trying to connect it to a bigger story, but I'm also trying to make it real and authentic, and have the character be someone you can relate to. And I guess the saving grace for me is that suicide and drug addiction are two, especially heroin addiction, are two highly stigmatized issues, and yet I find it comforting, for lack of a better word, that I'm able to, write and talk about it, because all too often, especially around those issues, we tend to kind of go within ourselves and suffer in silence. And I guess what I'm hoping is to help people understand that you need not be alone.
I think it's very helpful. Did anybody reach out to you after you published that book and say that it helped them in that way? I was just curious if you heard from anybody.
Oh, sure. A lot of people have, and I speak a lot, on do book readings and things like that. And usually, when I bring up those issues, there's at least one person who will take me aside and say, I've had that, and they'll talk privately and share their pain. You do not have to scratch very deeply in anyone to find pain and loss.
No, it doesn't. And I think you're right that drug addiction is one of those things that there's a lot of self blame where there doesn't need to be. And
Right.
so it's a very difficult topic to discuss for people. And, it's not the same as saying, hey, my kid died of cancer. To say they died of drug addiction is a really
Right.
difficult thing for people to say.
Oh
And so,
man, and I mean that was an issue that I went through with grief counseling. I mean, guilt is probably your number one crippling
right.
emotional experience. And I mean, if you're going to judge me as a parent, get in line because I got there first.
Right.
You know,
Yeah. And even if you had done everything right in the world, which no parent ever has, I mean, no parent ever does anything right. It's, and obviously it was going to happen either way, but yeah. So I think really, really you speaking here today, you writing your book, I think has been probably very beneficial to so many people. So I
I
appreciate
hope
it.
so. Thank you.
I know so many people who are experiencing so many of the same things that you did. So it's
Mm.
great. You teach a class, a workshop on exactly this topic. Is there anything that you would like to share that we have not discussed today that you do normally share in your workshop that you think might be helpful?
Oh, you're putting me on the spot, aren't
I
you?
sure am.
I don't know. I think we covered a lot of the ground. I can't think of anything offhand. And of course, a lot of my writing workshops don't just deal with grief. They deal with writing a novel,
Hmm.
staying organized. Any number of facets of the novel writing process. I deal with fear. That's almost my commencement address when I talk to my students, because fear is a constant companion of a writer, especially when it comes time to, sharing what you've done with someone else, because, we are our worst critics. And I can't tell you how many people I've talked to who I think have allowed fear to inhibit them to the point where they haven't really tried yet, or they've tried, but they haven't had the courage to share it with someone else. And the interesting thing about courage is that it's not the absence of fear, it's harnessing the fear.
Right.
It's going forward in spite of the fear. That's what the guys did on Normandy on D-Day. They were terrified, but they went forward anyway. And that's the definition of courage: fear in action.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, I mean, I think you've taught a lot of people to do exactly that. I know you taught me to step off a cliff in terms of just keep writing, just keep doing it. I mean, I think that's a lot of it is put your pen to the paper and just do it. That's a lot of what happens in a writing prompt is it forces you to just do it.
Yeah,
and not
yeah,
think so much about if it's right or if it's wrong or where it's going
exactly.
to be.
That's
So,
part of writer's block. I think writer's block, the fundamental aspect of it is fear. And if
right.
you can just get over that and write anyway, it doesn't have to be perfect the first time.
No,
It'll have to be perfect when you pitch an agent, as perfect as it can be. But first drafts, they're never perfect,
no.
ever.
Yeah. And if you're writing for yourself for grief too, I mean, there's really no reason it ever has to be perfect or what is perfect. Because if you're writing for yourself, then, it's perfect because you wrote it.
Right. It maybe perfect is not the right word. Honest is, I think, a better
Yes.
word.
I love that word. Really, really love that word. And I think that's where the good writing comes from is honesty. And so,
Yeah.
yeah, I think it might be a good way to finish up. The only thing I want to add is give you an opportunity to, if you want to give your website, we can add that to the comments too at the bottom. But any ways of reaching you if people do want to take one of your workshops?
Probably the best way to get in touch with me is through my website, which is johndedakis.com. And of course, I'm blessed to have this, well, you see the name right there. You just
Mhm.
put all those, you just put it together, John Dedakis, put a .com after it. That'll get you to my website, and there's a contact me page there, and you can get me an email. Um, I'm on Facebook, and that's usually where I do a lot of the posting of my workshops. LinkedIn is another place where I hang out, and I don't write under a pseudonym. So, and there aren't too many John Dedakises that I know of. So, you shouldn't have too much trouble finding me if you're really looking for me.
Very good. I appreciate you being here today. I mean,
Thank you.
I can tell you from experience, anybody who's watching this, that his workshops are great. You should take one. And I really appreciate you
Thank
spending
you.
the time with us here today. We do have some other interviews coming up, and John, I'd love for you to watch those and give me some pointers on what's working and what's not. But people who want to follow along with our next interviews, we have one next Tuesday, I believe. You can just go to Retreat and Learn at YouTube or Facebook and subscribe and follow. And follow along. Let me know what other topics you want to talk about. So thanks very much, John. And I'm
Thank you.
sure I will be seeing you sometime soon.
Good. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.